Have you ever stopped to think that something as simple as salt can be a powerful weapon in the spiritual world? That's right, while many see it merely as a kitchen seasoning, in the Bible, salt carries deep secrets. It was used for purification, sacred covenants, and even spiritual warfare. But here's a warning, the enemy doesn't want you to know this. He tries to trivialize the meaning of salt, but today, you're going to discover what's behind this spiritual mystery. If you feel like your life is stuck, that certain areas seem to be held back by something invisible, pay attention. In ancient times, God's people used salt to break negative influences and spiritually cleanse environments. This isn't superstition, it's a biblical principle. Salt has the power to remove heavy burdens, and if you use it correctly, it will transform the atmosphere around you. But the big question is, how can salt become a weapon against darkness? Now, imagine walking into a place and feeling an inexplicable heaviness. The air feels thick, the environment seems strange, and something inside you tells you that something is wrong. Have you ever experienced this? This doesn't happen by chance. There is an invisible battle happening around you. And just as evil manifests in certain places, salt can be used as an element of purification and deliverance. Many people underestimate this, but those who understand the spiritual power of salt no longer live in darkness. But pay attention, salt by itself is not a charm. It doesn't work as a magical object but as a powerful symbol within God's principles. Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth." This means that salt not only preserves but also combats corruption and strengthens divine covenants. But are today's believers living out this truth? Or have they lost their spiritual flavor without even realizing it? This is one of the most serious questions you can ask yourself today. And what if I told you that Jesus himself used salt as a symbol of something greater? And that there is a biblical revelation behind this that few people know about? Believe me, this truth can change the way you see the spiritual world forever. So get ready, because now we're going to dive even deeper into the Bible to understand why Jesus called his disciples the salt of the earth. Have you ever wondered why Jesus chose salt as a metaphor for his disciples? Why didn't he just say we are the light of the world and leave it at that? Why did he insist on this comparison with salt? This was not by accident. There is a deep spiritual secret here, and most people simply don't realize it. In the Bible, salt appears several times, but one of the most explosive passages is in Matthew 5 verse 13, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned?" Jesus was saying something much greater than it seems. He was showing that salt has a purpose, and if it loses its essence, it becomes useless. Now think, how many people today are losing their spiritual identity without even noticing? In the Old Testament, salt was used to seal covenants, Numbers 18:19, as a symbol of faithfulness and commitment to God. It was also part of sacrificial offerings, Leviticus 2 verse 13, showing that nothing offered to God should be without salt. This means that salt represents holiness, separation, and purity. And now I ask you, how is your spiritual life? Do you still have that flavor, or have you become salt without effect? But here's the most terrifying detail, Jesus himself said that if salt loses its flavor, it is thrown out and trampled by men. This means that those who lose their spiritual essence become irrelevant and vulnerable to the forces of this world. And do you know what's worse? Many people are living exactly like this, without realizing they are being crushed by the enemy. Now, what if I told you that salt is directly linked to the power to break curses, cleanse territories, and establish spiritual dominion? Believe it, this is in the scriptures. And in the next section, you're going to discover how salt can be a true weapon in spiritual battles. Have you noticed that certain things in your life simply don't move forward? That there always seems to be an invisible barrier preventing you from growing, prospering, or even having peace in your own home? This is not a coincidence. There is a battle happening right now, and if you don't learn to fight the right way, you'll continue to be an easy target. The enemy doesn't want you to know that salt is a powerful tool in spiritual warfare. He knows that since biblical times, God's people have used salt to purify territories, seal covenants, and break curses. It's no wonder that the devil has tried to distort this knowledge, associating salt with occult practices. But let me tell you the truth, the devil doesn't create anything, he only copies and corrupts what God has already made. In the Bible, we see the prophet Elisha using salt to purify poisoned waters, 2 Kings 2 verses 19 to 22. Now, think carefully, if a simple handful of salt transformed bitter waters into sources of life, imagine what it can do in the spiritual world when used with faith. The problem is that many people don't know this and continue to suffer, being attacked, without realizing that there is a weapon at their disposal. Now, pay attention. Salt by itself has no magical power. It is a spiritual tool that works when used with prayer and biblical understanding. There are Christians being tormented in their own homes, marriages being destroyed, families living in constant conflict, simply because they don't know how to break these evil influences. But when you pray and use salt as a prophetic act, you are claiming purification and liberation over that environment. And if you think this is strong, wait until you understand God's true purpose for salt. It not only purifies and protects but also carries a spiritual meaning so deep that it can completely change your understanding of spiritual warfare. Have you ever stopped to think that nothing God created is without purpose? Fire burns, water gives life, wind moves, and salt. Salt preserves, purifies, and seals covenants. If God has been using it since the beginning of creation, why do so many people ignore the spiritual power it carries? In the Bible, salt was used in offerings and sacrifices, and God commanded that no offering be made without it. Now, stop and reflect, why did God require something as simple as salt in sacrifices? Because it represents purity, commitment, and incorruptibility. Just as salt prevents food from spoiling, it symbolizes the preservation of our covenant with God. But salt's purpose goes beyond that. It also reveals the power of consecration and protection. Just as Elisha used salt to purify the waters, you can use it as a symbol of spiritual cleansing over your life and home. This means that God has already given us physical elements to manifest spiritual realities, and salt is one of them. But are we going to use it the right way? Now, if salt has such a strong divine purpose, why do so many people live spiritually flavorless? Because they have distanced themselves from the essence of holiness and the covenant with God. When Jesus said that if salt loses its flavor, it is no longer good for anything, he was warning us about the danger of a faded faith, without commitment, without identity. This is serious. How many today call themselves Christians but have already lost their purpose and haven't even realized it? And here comes the most shocking point, salt does not just preserve, it seals eternal covenants. In the Bible, the covenant of salt represented an unbreakable pact with God, and if you understand this truth, your relationship with Him will never be the same again. If I told you that salt was once more valuable than gold, would you believe me? Well, today, it's on supermarket shelves, cheap, with no prestige. But in ancient times, salt was a symbol of power, wealth, and authority. And do you want to know the most shocking part? This value wasn't just economic, it also carried enormous spiritual weight. The Romans paid their soldiers with salt, and that's where the word salary comes from. Now, think about it. If an empire that dominated the entire world saw salt as something essential, what made us stop seeing it that way? Because it wasn't just in ancient Rome that salt had an elevated status, entire civilizations depended on it to survive. Without salt, food would rot, armies would starve, and kingdoms would collapse. But here's the most astonishing detail, salt wasn't just a commodity, it sealed covenants. In the Middle East, when two people ate salt together, it created an eternal bond of trust and loyalty. This means that a simple discovery of salt could determine the fate of entire nations. Now tell me, if men gave so much importance to salt, why do we ignore its spiritual value today? The Bible is not left out of this story. Salt appears in key moments of Scripture, always linked to purification, protection, and divine covenants. But the most intriguing thing is that the enemy has worked for centuries to trivialize what God has established as sacred. And when people forget the true meaning of salt, they lose a powerful weapon that could change their lives. Now, if salt has always been a symbol of authority and power, what happens when it is used the right way in spiritual warfare? Because, believe it, salt is not just history, it is still an active tool against invisible forces. If salt has so much power in the Bible, why do so many people not use it in their spiritual lives? Because, believe me, something is happening behind the scenes of the spiritual world, and the enemy wants you to ignore this truth. While many disregard the use of salt in faith, occult forces know exactly how to manipulate spiritual elements to influence environments, people, and even entire destinies. The Israelites never made an offering without salt. This means that anything presented to God first had to go through an act of purification. Now, stop and think, if God's people took this seriously, why do so many today think it doesn't matter? Could it be that we are losing a powerful spiritual principle simply because we have stopped applying it? But pay attention. Salt is not a talisman, it is a symbol of covenant and purification. And when used with biblical understanding and prayer, it can represent the cleansing of heavy environments, the breaking of negative influences, and even a spiritual restart. Have you ever felt that something is wrong in your home? That heavy atmosphere, constant conflicts, a cycle of stagnation. Have you ever considered that there might be something invisible trying to hold you back? Many Christians today live oppressed, not realizing that they could be using spiritual principles to strengthen themselves. Praying over salt, asking God to sanctify it, and then using it as a prophetic act can be a turning point in your life. And no, this is not superstition, this is acting in faith, just as Elisha did when he purified the waters with salt. Now, if salt can be used as an element of spiritual purification, what happens when it is used as a seal of covenant with God? Because there is a covenant called the covenant of salt, and very few people know what it really means. Have you ever heard of the covenant of salt? Well, know that this is one of the most powerful covenants in the Bible, yet many people have never even heard about it. And if God established something so strong, why has it been forgotten over time? What is the enemy trying to hide from you? In Numbers 18:19, God declares, "The covenant of salt between me and you is perpetual." Now, stop and reflect, if God called this covenant eternal, what does it mean for our lives today? Salt represents an unbreakable commitment, faithfulness, and the preservation of the divine covenant. In other words, when God makes a covenant with someone through salt, he is saying that this promise will never be corrupted. But here's the shocking point, in ancient Middle Eastern culture, if two people ate salt together, they established a lifelong loyalty pact. This means that there was no way to break this commitment. Now, think about it, if men already considered salt a seal of loyalty, imagine the weight of this when the covenant is made directly with God. Now, let me ask you something, how many people today live as if this covenant does not exist? How many Christians say they follow God but live weak, without identity, without spiritual strength? Is the salt of the covenant still in them? Because Jesus was clear, if salt loses its flavor, it is thrown out. And this is too serious to be ignored. Now, what if I told you that this covenant not only protects spiritually but also has the power to purify territories and change destinies? Yes, salt was even used by prophets to bring healing and deliverance to entire places. If I told you that a simple use of salt could transform environments and shift spiritual situations, would you believe it? It sounds crazy, but the Bible proves it. The problem is that many people don't understand the power of prophetic acts and end up living a weak spiritual life without authority. In 2 Kings 2 verses 19 to 22, the prophet Elisha used salt to purify bitter waters, and they became a source of life. But what does this really mean? It wasn't just about water, it was about the restoration of an entire territory. And now comes the question, how many areas of your life are bitter, stagnant, and in need of purification? Here's what no one tells you: prophetic acts are not magic, they are visible projections of faith. When a person prays over salt and uses it as a prophetic act in their home, their business, or their life, they are aligning themselves with divine principles that bring restoration and spiritual transformation. In your life, she is spiritually declaring that the atmosphere needs to be transformed. And do you know the secret? It works when done with faith and understanding. But pay attention. The enemy knows the power of salt and tries to distort its meaning. Many practices misuse salt, attempting to pervert a principle that has always belonged to God's people. But let me tell you a truth: the devil has no right to steal what God created for his people. If in the Bible salt was used for purification and liberation, why would you stop using this spiritual tool in your life? Now, what if I told you that salt was also used as an instrument of judgment in the Bible? Yes, the same salt that purifies can also be a sign of divine warning. Have you ever noticed that in the Bible, God was never consulted in vain? Everything he does has a purpose, a meaning, a message. And with salt, it is no different. But here is a warning: the same salt that brings purification and victory can also be a symbol of divine justice. And very few people talk about this. Remember Lot's wife? In Genesis 19 verse 26, she looked back and was turned into a pillar of salt. That was not just any detail, it was a warning sign for all of humanity. What does this mean? That when a person insists on living in the past, disobeying God's direction, they can become spiritually stagnant, lifeless, and purposeless. How many people today are paralyzed, stuck in what they have been through, unable to move forward? But it doesn't stop there. In Deuteronomy 29 verse 23, God says that a cursed land would be marked by salt and sulfur, a symbol of destruction and judgment. In other words, salt also represents what has been handed over to judgment. Now, think carefully: if God used salt to judge lands and people in the past, wouldn't he continue using signs to warn his people today? Now comes the most serious part: salt was not made to be under a curse, it was made to preserve, purify, and protect. But if a person does not understand their spiritual role, if they lose their essence, they may end up living exactly like salt that has lost its flavor, thrown out and trampled by men. That's powerful. How many Christians today are being defeated because they do not understand what they were meant to carry? But the good news is that the cycle of the curse can be broken. There is a spiritual tool that can be used for this: consecrated salt. Have you noticed that some families seem trapped in repetitive cycles of suffering? Never-ending poverty, illnesses passing through generations, marriages being destroyed one after another. This is not just bad luck. This is a spiritual pattern. And if there is a cycle, it can be broken. The Bible shows that curses can be passed from generation to generation, but here is the key that almost no one talks about: God always provides a way for deliverance. And salt, when consecrated and used with understanding, can be a powerful symbol of that deliverance. Just as Elisha used salt to purify contaminated waters and restore a city, it can also be a prophetic act to cleanse environments and cut off evil influences. Now, pay attention: the devil wants your family to remain trapped. He wants you to believe that certain things are normal, that it's just part of life to live in debt, depressed, or defeated. But the Bible says otherwise. You have the right to reject any evil inheritance and take possession of a new spiritual reality. So what are you waiting for to take action? But here is the most shocking detail: if you do not close spiritual doors, the same problems can keep repeating themselves in your home. And this is exactly why many people live trapped in cycles of destruction, without realizing that there are spiritual tools to break free from this once and for all. Salt, when used in prayer and consecration, can represent the purification of a home, the breaking of old covenants, and the beginning of a new cycle of blessings. And what if I told you that this concept is not new and has been applied in ancient Middle Eastern traditions? Yes, there is something even deeper about the use of salt as a sign of covenant and deliverance. Have you noticed that in the Bible, God never does anything without a purpose? Every symbol, every element, every detail has a profound meaning. And salt is one of the most powerful. But there is something that few people know: salt has always been a symbol of covenant and commitment, not only in faith but in entire cultures throughout history. In ancient Middle Eastern times, when two people ate salt together, it sealed a pact of eternal loyalty. This meant they were committed to each other forever. There was no turning back. If one betrayed the other, it was like breaking a sacred oath. Now, think, if men already considered salt a sign of an unbreakable covenant, imagine what it means when God establishes a covenant of salt with his people. Numbers 18:19 reveals this powerful truth: it is an everlasting covenant of salt before the Lord. This means that when God makes a covenant, he does not break it. But the question is, how many people today are living as if this covenant does not exist? How many Christians have lost their flavor, their faithfulness, the essence of this connection with God? If salt loses its flavor, it is good for nothing. And now, here is the most serious part: in many ancient traditions, if someone broke a salt covenant, it was as if they had brought their own sentence of disgrace upon themselves. This means that salt was not just a symbol, it carried spiritual weight, honor, and consequences. And if God has given this covenant to us, are we honoring this commitment, or are we stepping on it without realizing it? Now, what if I told you that salt was also used as a spiritual weapon to seal territories and declare authority over environments? Yes, the same principle that marked covenants was also used in spiritual warfare. If you knew that there was a powerful spiritual weapon to protect your home, your family, and your life, would you use it? Because this weapon was revealed thousands of years ago, and many Christians simply ignore its power. Salt is not just a seasoning, it is a divine element that can be used in spiritual battle to cleanse, purify, and break evil strongholds. Since biblical times, God's people have used salt to declare dominion over territories and drive out evil forces. Do you think it was a coincidence that Elisha used salt to purify contaminated waters? That was not just a physical act, it was a spiritual decree. And now think, if salt was used to restore an entire city, what can it do inside your home, at your workplace, or in your family environment? The devil does not want you to know this. He operates in darkness, in ignorance, and takes advantage when people do not understand the spiritual principles that God has given to his people. That's why so many homes are filled with conflicts, fights, illnesses, and discouragement, without realizing that they can pray and use salt as a prophetic act of release. But pay attention, salt has no power in itself, it is merely a tool that must be used with faith. When you consecrate salt in prayer, asking God to make it a symbol of purification and protection, you are declaring that your home, your life, and your family belong to the Lord. And the enemy cannot remain where there is holiness and authority. Now, what if I told you that Jesus gave a very serious warning about salt and what happens when it loses its purpose? Because, believe me, it's not enough to have salt, you need to know how to use it with faith. Here's a hard but necessary truth: there is no point in using salt if you don't have faith. Salt is not a charm, nor a magical object, it is a spiritual principle. If you just throw salt around without prayer, without understanding, without faith, it's nothing more than an empty ritual. And Jesus was very clear about this: if salt loses its flavor, it is good for nothing. The Bible shows us that when a divine principle is used incorrectly, it can become a problem. Want an example? The Israelites made a bronze serpent by God's command, but later it turned into an idol, and they were punished. In other words, when we remove God from the center, even something that was sacred can become useless. This means that salt without faith, without purpose, without obedience, is nothing but dust. Now, look around you, how many people are living without spiritual flavor? People who once had a life with God but have become salt without taste, without strength, without authority. People who just follow empty rituals but have no real connection with the Holy Spirit. This is dangerous because Jesus said that flavorless salt is thrown out and trampled by men. And how many Christians today are exactly like this, being crushed by the world? But here's the key: if you have faith, if you understand what you are doing, if you consecrate everything to the Lord, then salt becomes a powerful symbol of God's presence in your life. The problem is not in the salt, it's in how it is used. Do you have enough faith to live this spiritual reality? Or, without realizing it, are you living a flavorless, powerless, and empty life? Now, what if I told you that, beyond all this, Jesus gave us a clear mission to be the salt of the earth? And that there is an enormous responsibility on those who understand this principle. Because, believe me, it's not enough to know, you must act. Now that you understand the spiritual secret of salt, the most important question is, what will you do with it? Because knowing deep biblical truths means nothing if you don't apply them to your life. Salt has a purpose, it has power, it has a calling, and believe it, this also applies to you. Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth," Matthew 5 verse 13. This means that it's not enough just to have faith, you need to live as someone who preserves, purifies, and makes a difference in the world. But look around, how many Christians today are dim, weak, and without identity? People who should be transforming environments but instead are being transformed by the world. This is serious. What would Jesus say about your life today? Do you still have flavor, or have you lost your essence? Now, if something inside you is awakening, this is not a coincidence. Maybe God is calling you to a deeper level, to a stronger covenant, to a more alive faith. Maybe He is showing you that there are areas in your life that need to be purified, restored, and set free. And if you've read this far, don't ignore this call. What will you do now? Will you let this knowledge die here, or will you apply it to your life? Will you continue living on autopilot, or will you take action and transform your spiritual atmosphere? The decision is yours. But know this, the world needs Christians who are truly the salt of the earth. And if you believe in this, then it's time to act. If this content made sense to you, don't forget to like, comment, and share. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and keep learning truths that can change your spiritual life forever.